I'm sure we've all heard about the infamous Squidward's suicide. Well, I'm going to give you more background of the original story that story does not mention. The first episode appeared in 2002, when it was first aired across the world on Monday, July 1st, 2002, at 3 a.m. GMT. Thousands of children were left weeping and shaking, traumatized for life. On the other hand, this isn't the only time it's been played. Between 2002 and 2015, it had been played at least approximately 3 times a year, scarring children for life every single time. Children would be left convulsing violently and vomiting over themselves. Enraged parents would call in demanding that they shut down the channel immediately, but because it wasn't in the episode log, Nickelodeon just assumed that it was a silly prank call from kids putting on a voice. Nickelodeon employees were even told to slam the phone down on any calls mentioning the episode. Nickelodeon kept an episode log of every episode that had been played on Nickelodeon so that they could either prove or disprove any allegations of inappropriate content being aired. Episodes are automatically added as they are aired. However, Squidward's suicide never once made an appearance in the episode log for unknown reason. The episode became known to Nickelodeon the night of October 21st, 2005, when it was sent to Nickelodeon employees as a supposed premiere of Season 4. The tape was quickly incinerated and Nickelodeon thought they had seen the last of it. However, it continued to play on Nick, unbeknownst to Viacom. I bet you're asking why Nick didn't catch on after this. It's because Nick gets hundreds of prank calls about non-existent episodes. The most recent joke being Timmy hangs himself, which purports to be a fake episode of The Fairly Odd Parents. I guess Nick assumed the version they saw was part of the sick joke. It was playing for the last time in the night of the 4th of November 2015, which had the exact same effect as at all the other showings of it did. After it played for the last time, any evidence of the episode was completely wiped away. Camcorders, laptops, and phones and footage of the episode went up in flames and leaked acid from the battery compartment, rendering them completely unusable. After the very last showing, it was believed that we had seen the last of anything related to Squidward's suicide, and we could finally get on with our lives completely fearless. How I wish that this was true. On Tuesday, January 5th, 2016, the original Squidward Suicide was replaced by Squidward Suicide 2, the direct sequel of the original. It played on Nickelodeon at approximately 2 a.m. GMT, where a handful of unlucky people witnessed it. I was one of those unlucky people. It was a cold winter's night. In fact, it was so cold that there was a thin sheet of frost on my window. Rain tapped softly against my frostbitten window as I snored cozily, unaware of the horrors I was about to experience. I woke up from a nightmare with a start, a nightmare so horrific I was lying there, drenched in my own sticky sweat and panting my lungs out. However, looking back on it, the nightmare was nothing compared to what I saw that night. The very first thing I noticed upon waking up was that I felt sick to my stomach. It had been New Year's Eve 4 days before, and let me tell you, I had had one hell of a wild night. I even ended up with my boyfriend's lampshade on my head at one point. But that's a completely different story. I still haven't recovered from the wildness of seeing the new year in. I grunted and turned to look to my alarm clock. The room had a dark crimson glow to it which was coming from the light of the alarm. It read 1:30 a.m. It was far too early to get up. I rolled back over and tried to go to sleep, but my stomach was too painful for me to even begin to try and do that. After 30 futile minutes, I gave up the ghost and decided to go downstairs. I rolled out of bed and proceeded to step out of my room and then immediately go into the living room. The living room was pitch black and freezing cold. I swear I could hear moaning in the darkness. I felt as if I was being watched on and judged. Every single move I made, something somewhere was following them with its gigantic eyes. Maybe I've just gone completely crazy. I certainly feel sick up in the head. Now, if I could go back and change anything I'd ever done, it would have been what I did next. I'd rush in and scream, "No, don't do this. Go read a book, go on your computer, do something, anything except that." But I didn't. I stepped gingerly towards the TV and pressed on the button. Fancying watching some trashy late-night talk show, the TV whirled alive and flickered a few times like it always does when it's finding the network. It finally connected to the network and sprang to life. The channel was switched to Nickelodeon. No, I don't watch Nick by myself. My little sister was over earlier and wanted to watch Sam and Cat, so I switched it on for her. I was just about to switch over to watch, but just as I reached for the TV remote, a loud announcement came on that stopped me in my tracks. "Now haven't we got a treat for you tonight?" A deep, loud voice boomed out. This got me completely off guard. My hand jolted open and the remote hit the ground with a deafening thud and shattered into a million pieces onto my red tile carpet. "A brand spanking new Spongebob episode especially for you," the threatening voice blurted out. I must admit my interest was piqued. I was a massive SpongeBob fan as a child, and the idea of seeing a brand new SpongeBob episode sounded something like heaven to me. I slouched down on my frayed, cracked sofa, and I got ready for the night's events to unfold right in front of me. The screen went pitch black for a few uncertain seconds, and then the episode began. The SpongeBob intro started to play as usual, but it seemed off somehow. The tune was distorted and the background animation had a dark shadow cast upon it. This sent chills shooting down my spine. I don't know how, but it was at that exact moment I knew something was very off about this episode. Nevertheless, I pushed on, praying that it was just a normal SpongeBob episode. The intro ended with Squidward appearing inside instead of SpongeBob. He wrapped his mouth around his clarinet and proceeded to make a high-pitched squealing noise that sent my teeth on edge. He then turned to look it straight in the eyes and gave me a sadistic, twisted smile before fading into blackness. The screen then faded to loud static for a few full seconds before jumping straight to the title card. The title card was a deep crimson color with splashes of lighter red appearing on it. It looked as someone had been slaughtered right in front of it, and the blood that had been left to dry and became crumbly. In dripping black letters, the title read, "Squidward's Suicide 2. No, I said, paralyzed by terror. I wanted to turn back, I really did. However, I knew I couldn't. I had to know what came next. And it was just something that I couldn't turn down, no matter how much I should have. The episode began with Squidward lying on his bed and the top of his head torn clean off, brain matter and crimson blood leaking out of the infected wound and dribbling onto his now soggy bed sheets. Suddenly, the pupils in his eyes began to race around in his head in a wild and unpredictable manner, all the time getting faster and faster until they finally stopped and Squidward let out a deep, pain-filled scream. The camera slowly panned off of Squidward. When it was completely above him, the screen twitched and began to show a completely different scene. The scene showed Squidward against a gray and empty background. Below it, dark whispers and spine-chilling clarinet playing could be heard. Squidward was standing there. In his eyes a deep feeling of terror was expressed. He was all alone. He started to take a few nervous steps towards the right, completely unsure of himself. He continued to walk, picking up the pace until he was finally sprinting, whining in complete and utter terror. He continued to run until he came upon a house in the dark, dismal wasteland. The house was stone gray and threateningly tall. The sign outside said in carved crimson letter, "The Bleed Household." Squidward took a few seconds to analyze the house and recoiled in abject terror. "There's gotta be another house somewhere," Squidward panted in a crazed manner. "Please, please, please!" He ran for miles and miles, but to no avail. He was completely alone. "No, I can't go in there!" Squidward yelled in fright. He flopped to the ground with an earth-shattering thud. He began to weep, thick, bloody tears dribbling down his pain-stretched face. Now, usually in SpongeBob, when a character cries, the resulting noise is done in a humorous manner. This wasn't. It sounded like an actual human howling. The noise filled to bursting with pain and suffering. Next, a horrific time-lapse of Squidward starving was shown. At first, it wasn't so bad. Squidward was just getting skinnier and skinnier. But soon, it got worse. His ribs began showing, looking full to burst straight out of his malnourished veins. Veins began to push out in a painful manner, so close to the surface that you could see his blue blood circulating through his broken body. It looked so realistic, almost like a real person starving. Squidward weakly clambered up to his feet, realizing he was going to die if he didn't eat soon. He stepped gingerly towards the threatening house, shaking more with every step. He reached the blood-soaked front door and proceeded to knock on it. A female Squidward, dead, peeling skin and bloodshot eyes, opened the door. When she cast her eyes on poor Squidward, her face exploded with rage. "What do you want?" "Must eat now," he whimpered, holding his stomach. "I need you to do me a solid if you think you're going to be touching a crumb of my food." She handed him a blood-stained meat cleaver. "My son is in his room. End him." "What? No, I can't. I really can't," Squidward cried. "Fine then. Die and rot for all I care." "Oh, okay," he whispered. He slumped into the tiny squid's room, hanging his head. He began to weep softly. Following him was the sadistic she-devil. "What's up, bro?" the mini squid said, completely unaware of the pain he was about to endure. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," Squidward howled. Squidward grabbed hold of the small boy and held him fiercely against the bed he used to sleep in. He grabbed the poor kid's arm and snapped it in two. A thick flow of crimson blood poured from it and stretched veins were exposed. The child cried out in pain, screaming to be let be, but Squidward was deaf to this. Squidward then pinned the kid to his bed and drove the knife straight into his stomach and pulled it out again. Blood sprayed out of the jagged wound, coating the wall behind them. The crimson-coated Squidward grabbed hold of the kid's neck and with a full pull snapped it in two. The tiny boy went completely silent. He was gone. To confirm the kill, he saw the little squid's head off, blood splattering all over the room and Squidward. His head fell to the floor, lifeless and cold. Eyes that once held happiness, tears and fear, were now completely blank. Squidward took a few steps back, and then began to howl in pain. He flopped on the floor and wept loudly, covering his eyes with his tentacles. Crimson tears soon began dribbling down his face. "I took that poor boy's life, and for what? A piece of toast?" He pounded the floor with rage-fueled fist. "Well done," the cold-hearted woman said, throwing Squidward a few wrapped snack cakes. "You monster! You monster!" he yelled. "I'll never forgive you for this." He stuffed the cakes into his mouth hungrily as he wept all over the blood-soaked carpet. "Squidward, can you hear me?" A soft voice whispered over the top of it. Squidward opened his pain-filled eyes. He was sitting in a bright white hospital. A soft beeping noise could be heard in the background. I was so relieved that he was okay. Standing in front of him was the same fear-inducing woman that had appeared in his nightmare. "It's okay," she said softly. Suddenly, a sadistic look crossed her eyes. She grabbed a pair of blood-splattered surgical scissors and plunged them straight into Squidward's weak heart as she laughed maniacally. A meaty, bloody squelch could be heard as the scissors went deeper and deeper, doing even more damage with every inch. When they wouldn't go in any further, the woman jolted the scissors open and crimson blood and muscle tissue splattered all over the screen, covering it completely. After this, the episode faded to static before ending abruptly. I wish I could erase the memories I have of that episode out of my mind. Sadly, I don't think that'll ever happen. Every night I have petrifying nightmares which leave me panting and drenched in sweat. That thing that stuck with me this most was how forlorn Squidward looked after he slaughtered that kid, and how he didn't have any other kind of choice. As far as I know, the episode is still in circulation. So I'm begging you, do you can to prevent this from happening? Okay, this pasta was a bit of a mixed bag for me, in my opinion. While I certainly can say that the story wasn't exactly the greatest in the world, there definitely was at least a bit of an effort in regards to the actual telling of a story. Lost episode wise, that is. I'm not specifically talking about the whole pasta, but specifically the lost episode part. Rather than just a bunch of unnecessary random crap happening like in most lost episode creepypastas that I've read on this channel or that I've seen, especially on a place like GeoChia for that matter. However, with that said though, the story isn't obviously without its flaws, which of course is pretty much going to be covered up right about now. The protagonist in the story really didn't fit too well with this story. Now, while he isn't a complete idiot, he's certainly not one of the best out there, and that's saying a lot for these kinds of stories. One of the things about the protagonist that really irked me a good bit is the fact that he tends to get a bit of a overdramatic reaction to certain things and events happening outside of the actual episode itself. Specifically, a couple of the parts where he goes into detail about going into the living room and thinking that eyes are watching him, that this or that. Look, don't get me wrong. I'm not gonna lie. Walking into a dark room can definitely kind of trigger something, especially if you've been asleep for a long time. And had the protagonist actually explained that it likely was something that was going on with their mind because of the fact that they were tired, then this would be a little bit more realistic and a little bit more forgivable. But unfortunately, that just isn't the case. In fact, even the protagonist goes out of his way to say that, oh, I'm probably crazy, aren't I? It's like, no, dude, you're not crazy. You never were crazy. You're just tired. You literally woke up from a nightmare. You're probably groggy as all hell, and you're probably, questioning why you're even down there in the freaking living room to begin with. I mean, at the very least, go and make yourself a pot of coffee or something if you're gonna be up that late. But still, I mean, that part, including a couple of other parts that are mentioned in the story, really just doesn't exactly fit to an actual person's reaction. Now, maybe I could be wrong on that end. Maybe there are some people who do tend to overreact to these things, which there probably are a lot of people who do. But yeah. Now, while I don't particularly care about this protagonist's reactions, I will go out of my way and say that despite the fact that the protagonist went a little bit too overreactionary to certain things, at the very least we did get a good bit of visuals and everything. There is that. With that said though, I still have another main issue with this protagonist. And that's how in the hell does he know about the episode airing as much as it does? How the hell does he know that Nickelodeon's been getting calls and things like that about, it's like ring, 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 ring. Hello, this is Nickelodeon Studios. What the fuck do you want? Oh my gosh, there was like a spooky Squidward episode playing right now. My kid's like crying and shitting himself. It's like too spooky for me. He has like bloody eyes and poop or whatever coming out of his eyeballs. Like, oh my freaking god, this is like so spooky. Please do something or else I want to talk to your manager. And it's like, I don't fucking care, you idiotic sack of shit. Click. Something like that. How in the hell would he be able to know that? It's not mentioned anywhere in the story how the protagonist knows this. And this is a very big problem when it comes to lost episode stories, is that oftentimes or not, they never go out of their way to describe the reasoning as to why they know this information to begin with. I mean, it could have been from any kind of place. It could be from a news website. It could be from word of mouth. It could be freaking something that, I don't know, this person wind up hearing in the cafeteria at lunch at school. Any kind of explanation would have seriously worked out a whole lot better than just having this chunk of information being thrown in without any kind of, well, okay, I wouldn't say context, but without any logical explanation. That is a major problem with stories like these. It takes away from the realism of the story when things like this aren't explained properly in the beginning of the story, as they prevent any kind of logical reasoning as to how, why, and what something like this is so well known to the protagonist without some kind of actual legitimate, or hell, I'll even go out of my way and say, possible uncredible sources, whether they be word of mouth, news articles, anything like that. That right there is already a main problem with this protagonist here, is there's that. Not to mention the fact that the protagonist, that, like I've said, isn't a terrible one, but one of the bigger problems that I really do have with this protagonist is the fact that if you read the story, which I will provide a link down below, I mean, obviously you've all listened to it, but if you want to take a relook, link down below, about the protagonist sitting there and just kind of, around the end, just acting completely and utterly at the end. Why are creepypasta stories like this? Why are lost episode creepypastas always the same? Why does it always have to sit there and constantly repeat the same thing over and over and over again when it comes to a protagonist? Very rarely, and I know I sound like a broken record here because I've said that kind of thing so many times beforehand. People who sit there and make these lost episode pastas very rarely, if ever, actually give a good protagonist. And this story gets hurt a good bit because of this. I mean, again, there are some positives. The protagonist isn't a complete idiot. They don't immediately react to certain things or, well, actually, no, I'm probably wrong here. Because this protagonist actually went out of their way and said that they wanted to start crying because Squidward started crying. Okay, so there's that. Okay, perhaps maybe I am wrong on this one. Maybe the protagonist is a complete idiot. If that is the case, then yeah, that really knocks down a couple of points with this story. But despite that, there are a couple of other things about the story that wow, my brain's already melting, isn't it? The protagonist isn't perfect. The protagonist isn't good, but it's passable for the most part. Just simply passable. At least to me, that is. This might come across as a bit of a surprise to some people, but I actually didn't really mind this episode. Sure, it was pretty cliched with the blood, the gore, and everything else, but one thing that I actually think helped save this pasta from being a complete total train wreck was a storyline that was included into the story. Now, normally when it comes to lost episode creepypastas, most of them don't really seem to follow a set storyline or plot that adds to the, that either adds to the story, adds to the characters, or adds to any level of visualization to the story, not to mention interest as well. Most of the creepypastas in question oftentimes go out of their way and they throw in a bunch of random and insane crap being included in. Like, for example, a character crying blood, and, well, technically that does happen, but, I mean, it is, it is a sequel to the story, so I'm willing to give it, a little bit of a pass for that end. Maybe I shouldn't, but I will be willing to go out of my way and do that. But specifically with, characters crying and, saying, I don't want to do this anymore, and, just going out of their way and grabbing a watermelon and eating it and then choking to death and dying and then becoming a spooky, scary ghost with a giant butcher knife who goes out of their way and just stabs the people who did them wrong in some way, shape, or form with bloody eyes, and vomiting gore and black, whatever it may seem to be. Creepypastas like those oftentimes just throw everything completely out. It's like the people who write these kinds of stories don't sit there and want to put in the time nor the effort into sitting there and actually making sure of it that the story is decent. Or at the very least doesn't want to include a story because that's too hard, or I just want to write what I want to write. And fine, you want to write a crappy cliche pasta, that's your deal. But still, this creepypasta is one of the few that, while I don't think is amazing, at least actually had a pretty decent concept to it. And, of course, one of the things that I really liked about this episode was the fact that instead of it just being, like I've said before, a random episode with just insane crap happening almost immediately, which I will admit does happen a little bit with the story with the static, but we'll get to that later. But instead it starts off with the ending of the original story and kind of builds up after that to the aftermath of what happened after Squidward sat there and splattered calamari juice all over the place. Which personally for me, I actually found to be interesting and kind of refreshing to a degree. The characters as well, even the newer ones that were included in this one, specifically the mother, but strictly speaking, Squidward in this didn't really break too much character in the story, which is a very major rarity when it comes to stories like these. Let me just make that excessively clear that, when it comes to creepypastas of this nature. Sorry about that, that's my cat meowing. Come here, kitty, kitty, kitty. Come here, kitty, kitty, kitty. Come here. Come on, I hear you meowing. Come on. Get in here. Alright. Again, sorry about that, everyone. Anyway, so what I was basically getting at was that when it comes to most pastas, most of the time they have characters that go completely and utterly out of character. Now, while I will admit that Squidward does go a little bit break a little bit of character, during the later on when he's sitting there and killing the kid. Beforehand, however, he's still going out of his way and he's still pretty much doing, his usual thing. He acts, like he should in a way. And the mother on this one, I will admit, was an interesting inclusion with the story, especially given the fact that she's pretty crazy and psychotic and all that. For me personally, I think that if the story was fleshed out a little bit longer and actually built up a little bit more about this individual, then perhaps maybe the villain in question can actually be worthwhile. Now, still, but the story definitely kept, the characters in character until it was time for them to not do so, which, again, adds a lot more to the story in question, at least for me. Now, another thing about this episode that I did like was the visuals that were included in the story. There really aren't a whole lot of details in it, but I think that's probably a good thing. The details, including the ones about the backgrounds and the whole thing, pretty much add to help a lot more of a better visualization and pretty much went out of its way and helped, the story itself, when it came to the concept, the flow, and what was going on at that time. It helped a lot, and I find that to be one of the major positives when it comes to a story like these. Obviously, like with most Lost episode pastas, the biggest issue with these kinds of stories is the cliches. And while I personally don't consider most of these cliches included in the story to be a complete deal breaker, there were a good bit of them that really should have not been incorporated into the story. Or, at the very least, should have been worked together to make sure of it that the story itself actually, the cliches itself can work. This is a possibility. Plenty of Creepypasta Lost episode stories, like, for example, Dead Bard, Squidward Suicide, Suicide Mouse AVI, and a few others, very, very rarely are usually able to actually make cliches work properly. Of course, these cliches specifically that I have listed are ones that just didn't work. These are the ones that, if they were to be taken out or changed up or at least thrown in a way that worked, would definitely help improve the story's, improve the story's score. But specifically, these are just a couple of them. Number 1, static happening when it shouldn't. This is specifically started off at the very beginning, and I swear every time I see this, I want to grab my nearest alcohol bottle and just drink it until there's nothing left. I hate seeing this, especially when it comes to disc and things like that. VHS tapes, I can understand. If there's anything about VHS tapes, is that they are old and everything. Sometimes there usually is static at the beginning or not, especially if it's a home recording, but oftentimes this shouldn't be the case. So of course, just sitting there and having random static happening when it shouldn't definitely sits there and more or less just completely and utterly destroys. Okay, it doesn't destroy the story, but it's a complete eye roller, people. Having this being thrown in and included even around, I'd say, the end of the story, I can't really recall too well, but definitely at the very beginning was something that should not have been thrown in at all. Number 2, the swearing. I didn't include this in the pasta, in the narration, because obviously just throwing that in there was just, no. Basically, what it was the lady sitting there and calling Squidward a punk ass, which in all due honesty really isn't that bad. I really don't care if... It really isn't that bad of a word, personally, but at the same time, for a kid show like Spongebob, even for a creepypasta, incorporating swearing, like, the major swears and the like, definitely can and usually does bring your story down a good bit. Because, look, I don't care if it's a creepypasta. I don't care if it's made by... Look, I get it. The story in the episode was made by somebody else. I get that. But incorporating swearing is just something that I think is kind of tasteless. It doesn't really include much of anything with the episode itself. Now, outside of the episode, I have no problem with that. It's the actual episode in question, unless the specific show or movie or whatever does have swearing in it, then there's no reason to sit there and include that in there. It completely takes away from the characters, and it takes away from literally everything else in the story, especially for a show that doesn't have swearing in it. That's a problem with that Lost episode creepypastas do have. This isn't a very common cliche, thankfully, I could be wrong, but it does happen. And when it does happen, it just completely and utterly makes your story, well, it makes it laughable, personally. Number 3. The protagonist saying to avoid said episode if it's ever announced. How many times have we seen this? The Dora Lost episode, Caillou Lost episode, this Lost episode, that Lost episode. If you happen to ever see the episode playing on TV, or something along the lines of, if you hear an announcer say, this new episode is coming on, do not watch it. If you watch it, you'll boil a thing of oatmeal and you'll pour it in your ears and you will die. Report it to the police as much as you can and avoid it. Ooh, woo. How many times have you seen this in Lost episode pastas? Too often. Way too often. Hey, kitty. Way too often. Never, ever include this at the end of your story. Thankfully, though, this wasn't the official ending. It's still included, but it wasn't the official ending, so it didn't completely ruin the story for me personally. But still, it's like, if you're gonna go out of your way and you're going to include that, try to sit there and be a little bit more reasonable with that request. I mean, don't just sit there and be like, I saw this last episode, if you see it, don't click it, or whatever. It's like, fuck off with that bullshit. Seriously, just fuck off with that. It's a lazy attempt at trying to bring an ending in. It's not scary at all. It's never been scary. Never once has it ever been scary. Even when it was first introduced, it was completely laughable. Look, if you want to make this, if you want to go out of your way and make it slightly realistic in a way, don't include it. You know, guess what? Human beings naturally are very curious people. Going out of your way and saying, don't watch it, is just gonna sit there and fuel people's curiosity even more. Instead, if you really want to make it a little bit more realistic, sit there and say something along the lines of, I wouldn't recommend watching this because if you do, something like this could potentially happen. Something valid or logical, like legal action or whatever. Something that's realistic here. Or better yet, just, like I said, don't throw it in. It takes away from... It's lazy. That's it. It's just lazy. Number 4. And this is the biggest one. The excessive cruelty and gore that was added. I have no problem with gore being included in a creepypasta provided it actually makes sense. Provided it works fine. However, Squidward going out of his way and sitting there and doing the things that he did to the character in the actual episode was just completely pointless. It's like, really? You're gonna throw that in? I mean, at the very least, put a summary of what happened. Don't just throw in a bunch of gore for the sake of gore. I think I could probably have gone, plenty enough without having to know that Squidward sawed off someone's head. Although, let's be honest here, there's probably a YouTube animated video that actually has that, so wouldn't surprise me too much. But still, throwing that in just wasn't necessary. Now, I understand a little bit of detail and everything being thrown in, that's fine. But this was just one of those moments where it was a little bit too overtly detailed. Gore for the sake of just incorporating gore in the story, which, to me, kinda is wrong in a way. Not wrong like morally wrong, but just wrong as being lazy. Again, another element of laziness being... Actually, I don't even know if I could say laziness. That probably doesn't fit. Hang on. There we go. Okay. Specifically was just gore for the sake of incorporating a ton of gore. if you really want to include something like that, that's fine. Just make sure that it works properly. This did and it didn't at the same time. All of these things could have worked if the pasta was panned out a little bit more, which is another complaint I have with the story, is that it's not panned out properly. And of course, the characters' motivations were put a little bit more detail as well. I mean, this story, while not short, is definitely needs to be a little bit longer. But again, that's just me. Well, I haven't had one of these in a while, but while reading the story, I was able to come up with a bit of a potential theory regarding the episode itself. The theory itself being that Squidward, after having done what he had done in the original story, was sent to hell after doing what he had done. This is primarily evident with the story mentioning Squidward's eyes moving around rapidly before finally going still. This was likely because of the last bit of consciousness, although let's be logical here, there likely was none. I mean, especially if you have brain matter all over the place, you're pretty much dead right then and there. However, basically the last bit of it basically succumbing primarily to his injuries. And upon finally, the episode itself finally going into black, Squidward's soul is then sent to the forested area, which was a nod to the original Creepypasta, basically where he basically the afterlife. His afterlife, pretty much, his own personal hell. Which, of course, with the only place being the resident being the woman's home. And of course, any attempts that Squidward has tried making repeatedly was met with an eternity of just going into the forest and seeing the same house on repeat numerous times over and over and over again. Then, of course, in many different religious mythologies regarding the nature of hell, Squidward is, of course, put there, according to very many religious organizations and the like's teachings, that taking one's life is one of the classified as the unforgivable act, or the unforgivable sin, quote-unquote. Note, I personally do not believe this myself, at all. But, according to many different religious belief systems and the like, specifically stating whenever someone does this kind of thing to themselves, they're immediately classified as being condemned on this end. Whether it be go to like a specific place for karma, or because it's basically just, I don't know. But basically what it is upon doing so, Squidward was basically thrown in here. And of course, the woman in question also is another addition, given the fact that she herself is pretty much the one demon that was sent to sit there and torment Squidward through various psychological and physical torments and the like. I mean, if you really, and again, read the story itself and take a look and try and see whether or not if you believe this to be the case or not. And of course, gradually over time, especially with the ending, with the ending of the episode where Squidward is constantly being tormented by this woman, again, specifically with her acting as a nurse and things like that, jamming scissors into Squidward's chest, and basically tormenting him, and he never dies in this. Normally if you have scissors being stuck in and everything, you're not ever going to sit there and outright die from that if it's basically your soul that's being tormented here. And that's basically what it is. I understand if there's going to be some kind of flaws or loopholes or problems even with this theory. It's been a while since I've done these, so again, apologies if this doesn't really make too much sense. And if anybody wants to sit there and add their own interpretation or reasoning why they think that this could be a probable theory, let me know down in the comments section below. I really would love to hear your own personal thoughts regarding this subject. My final thoughts of the story is that, while this pasta had some pretty good storytelling and was a bit of an interesting read for what it was, the cliches in this pasta really don't do this pasta a whole lot of justice. Not to mention the fact that the paragraph structuring the story was way too spaced out, but obviously besides that, the rest of the grammar was perfectly fine. And, of course, the cliches, the concept, and things of that nature, and personally for me, I really didn't mind the fact that this was a sequel to the original Squidward suicide story. Of course, however, it could have done a whole lot better had it been properly fleshed out, the storyline being increased a little bit more, and perhaps maybe even the protagonist sitting there and not being a complete dum-dum either. Outside of that, It's an okay story. It's not perfect, it's not terrible, but for me, it's just okay. That's really all I have to say. Which leads me to my final rating of this pasta. I'm gonna be fair and I'm gonna give the story a 4.5 out of 10. Again, like I said, it's a relatively okay story, but the excessive level of unnecessary cliches being tossed into the story, the protagonist and everything not providing proper sources, things like that, and just the story itself being way too short for what it is, and not being too fleshed out, I had to sit there and give it the rating that it did. But with that said, like I always say, this is only my opinion. It's a stupid personal opinion that I hold to, and it's my own, and that's pretty much about it. We're all entitled to our own opinions in regards to creepypastas of these kinds of this nature. And if you happen to disagree, that's perfectly fine too. I would like to hear your personal thoughts on the story. What did you guys think about this creepypasta? Did you guys think this was good? Did you guys think this was bad? Did you guys think it was average? Did you guys think it was meh? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments section below. Thanks again for watching today's episode, my little shadows, and if you guys enjoyed this video and you like what you saw, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and hit that bell notification as well if you desire to. And if you don't like the video, you can dislike it as well. That's perfectly fine as well. Also, make sure to leave down below your own personal thoughts and your own review regarding the story. The one thing that we always want to make sure to do on this channel, like with every video, is to not sit there and bash the author per se, but instead, actually we shouldn't really be bashing the author, period. But instead what we want to try and do is we want to make sure of it that the stories in question are properly criticized, so that way any author, future or now, can become better writers in the future. But again, thanks again for watching today's episode, my little shadows. I'll be seeing you guys in the next video, and like always, roll the outro because I'm out.
In fear and surprise as your eyes widen, your mouth goes dry with each battered breath. You try to scream, your mind begs to leave, glued to your computer screen. The killers they slash, the tapes burn and crash. The cartridge you bought will be your final haunt. The rituals of hate will seal your fate. The tears you shed will be from the fear-gripping horror-driven nightmarish gore-filled, terrorizing, hateful, burning, violent, rage-inducing, knife-slashing, blood-splattering, silent screams. Only time will tell if you will escape this online hell. Your horror-filled obsessions will come with its own regressions. Your pathetic screams will not be heeded in any way, because your nightmares will come at any time.